So not long ago now, I did a video about matchroom fighter Jalil Hackett's first defeat in the pro ranks, that being his defeat to Jose Roman Vazquez in Puerto Rico back on December 7th. And that brought me onto the topic of discussion of Eddie Hearn's newfound attitude towards his prospects and how he's reacted to their losses lately. Because a couple of Eddie Hearn fighters lost their O around the same time that Jalil Hackett did, and Jalil Hackett wasn't even the only Eddie Hearn fighter who lost their O that night. So today I'm going to take a look at those recent instances of matchroom prospects taking their first defeats, how Eddie Hearn has reacted to it, and what that could mean for young matchroom fighters going forward. But seeing as we're on the topic of Eddie Hearn, I'm also going to look into some of the other woes that he has faced lately, and what it could mean for matchroom boxing in general. Now when I speak of the woes Eddie Hearn has faced lately, that mainly pertains to his fighters either losing fights or missing out on opportunities. And yes, I know Eddie Hearn is loaded and he's been a very successful boxing promoter for over a decade. He'll be making even more money now as a result of Riyadh season, and he still does a good job of pushing for fights, complemented by the fact that he will of course be making a lot of money even if his fighters are losing. But as a promoter, you of course want your fighters winning, as that creates bigger opportunities for them going forward and more money can then go on to be made. So recently, the way matchroom fighters have been constantly losing has obviously got to hurt Eddie Hearn, but the way he is going about things has brought around the question of whether Eddie Hearn has his foot out of the door in the boxing game, and if he is losing his cunning competitive edge as a promoter. The way boxing has changed now as a result of Riyadh season is great for boxing, as Eddie Hearn has expressed himself. The best are starting to fight the best, and we are finding out which fighters are really the best as a result of these 50-50 fights. But as most clearly presented by that matchroom vs Queensberry 5 vs 5 card back in June, the new and improved competitive nature of boxing hasn't helped the record of Eddie Hearn's fighters, but it has of course helped the pockets of the fighters and Eddie Hearn himself. But how could the losses affect the business of matchroom boxing in the long run? Well, we'll get into this after we look at the recent losing of the O's of Eddie Hearn's prospects. So in late 2024 we saw 4 Eddie Hearn prospects either lose their O, or in one case, won a questionable decision, all within the space of 2 weeks, that being Cameron Vong, Jalil Hackett, Mark Castro and Chev Clark. Now all 4 of these guys came in as heavy favourites in their respective fights in late 2024 and did not have the best performances against the opponents who they were very much expected to defeat handily. Now it was mainly Eddie Hearn's reaction to the losses of Jalil Hackett and Mark Castro on that Puerto Rico card that caused all the backlash, but seeing as the same sort of thing happened to 4 of his fighters within the space of 2 weeks, then we might as well look at all of the cases. So yeah, in chronological order, we start with the prospect that came out the most fortunate after his fight, that being Cameron Vong, mainly because he didn't even officially lose the fight. And Eddie Hearn's post-fight comments weren't as harsh as they were for the next 2 fighters we're about to look at, despite the fact that you could arguably make less of a case for Vong winning his fight than you could for the other 3 prospects who actually lost on the cards. So the date was November 30th and the 22-year-old Cameron Vong, with a record of 6-0, came in as a 2-11 favourite against the 34-year-old Gavin Gwynn, who had a record of 17-3 with 1 draw and came in as a 4-1 underdog. Now, I won't give a whole play-by-play rundown of all these fights because we'll be here all day, but essentially, Gavin Gwynn outworked the young prospect for the most part of 10 rounds. Yes, Cameron Vong was picking the harder and more damaging shots in there, as seen by the state of Gwynn's face after the fight, and Vong didn't take much damage himself, but those precise power shots from Vong were few and far between compared to the constant swarming pressure and high output from Gavin Gwynn, to where it is really hard to make a solid case to give it to Vong on the cards. You know, at times Vong was trying to go defensive to pick counter shots, but Gwynn would just keep throwing a bunch of shots at him. And scoring wise, when you see someone outlanding their opponent to that extent in the exchanges, it's hard to not give them the round regardless of the supposed lack of effect of the punches. Hence why upon watching this fight back as research for this video, I actually scored the fight 7 rounds to 3 in favour of Gavin Gwynn, that being a 97-93 scorecard. But as for the official judges, they had it 96-95, 96-94 and 97-94, all in favour of Cameron Vong of course, a unanimous decision win for the young prospect. So yeah, here's Eddie Hearn's initial reaction to the result.
I think it's a very close fight. I've got to be honest, you know, I always back my fighters. I thought Gavin Gwynn edged the fight, probably 6-4. The better shots, the more effective shots came from Cameron. But it was the work rate and the punches landed. Although a lot of them weren't, you know, of great power, through a huge volume and a lot landed. So I think Cameron deserves massive credit for stepping up to that level. But I think Gavin Gwynn can leave thinking he was unlucky not to edge a decision. And to not get 1 card or even a draw, I think, you know, for me, I thought he deserved more out of the fight. Very close fight, but I think one thing we have to do is we have to run it back. Gavin Gwynn deserves that opportunity to go again. Tremendous fight. Cameron deserves so much credit for it, but we need to see it again.
Nothing too deep here, of course. As the promoter, it is his job to make out like his fighter won. But when your fighter wins on a robbery, you've got to talk like there was a case for your fighter winning, but still acknowledge the truth somewhat. And in other interviews, he just sort of said how it wasn't a robbery, but that he did have Gavin Gwynn winning and all that.
Gavin Gwynn, was it a robbery, Eddie?
I wouldn't say it was a robbery, but I thought he won. I don't like saying it because I always back my fighters, but I'm not going to lie to you at the same time. I thought it was a 6-4 kind of fight to Gavin Gwynn. I thought a draw would have been a touch. That's what I thought before the scorecards got read out, and that's just pure honesty. What I thought was particularly unlucky, I mean, I didn't like 97-93 to Cameron Bong, I just can't see it, was that, and this is a kind of how I felt in the Bivol fight and in the Madrimov-Crawford fight, we never got any action on the scorecards. Not a draw, not a split, do you know what I mean? Just unanimous. It's like, fuck, my side of the ring, nearly everyone thought Gavin Gwynn won. When I went to the other side, there was a few on the commentary box that thought Cameron Bong nicked it. But most people, as I understand it, thought that Gavin Gwynn deserved to edge a close fight. So robbery, no. Did I think Gavin Gwynn won? Honestly, yes. But in a very close fight. And I think Cameron Bong, I said to him in the ring after, look, I'm going to do an interview, and I've got to be honest, I didn't think you won the fight. And he's got to be better, by the way. And Gavin Gwynn's great. You know, Gavin Gwynn's proper old school, lovely bloke. You know, I kind of, even though we've got Cameron, I was gutted for Gavin because, you know, a win would have meant so much to him. So he'll get the chance to rematch him, but we should also give credit to Cameron Bong for taking those kind of step-ups.
So yeah, Eddie Hearn is saying the right stuff here, and it's not easy to have to admit that your guy should have lost, but you got to be honest out here. And all that talk of hoping for a draw is cliche, but what else can he really say? Since that fight happened, Eddie Hearn hasn't really spoken or been asked about it. And it's more so been Cameron Vong's manager Sam Jones that has been vocal about it, and has since made more of a case for a Vong win being fair in his interviews. And as for Eddie Hearn's matchmaking in this instance, well, it seems the matchmaking was actually done by Sam Jones.
We probably a fight too soon. Yeah. My fault, right? So we have a couple, and then we rematch him again. I've just told him that then, but we do it at our pace.
So yeah, Cameron Vong is under Eddie Hearn's Matchroom stable, but I don't think a lot of the heat fell on Eddie Hearn as a result of this fight. And again, this example is not like the others, as Cameron Vong actually won the fight on the cards despite what we saw in the ring. You know, when writing this video to this point, I've actually had to go back a few times and edit because I was literally speaking of this fight as if Cameron Vong lost it. But yeah, luckily for him, he kept his O, and there wasn't much criticism on Eddie Hearn here. But Eddie Hearn didn't quite know what was in store for him the very next week. Yes, that brings us to the fateful night in Puerto Rico on December 7th. Now, the headliner of this card was Liam Poirier versus Richardson Hitchens, and in that fight, Matchroom fighter Liam Poirier lost his O and his IBF Super Lightweight World title to Hitchens, but Hitchens is of course a Matchroom fighter as well, so this was an in-house affair in regards to promotional stables. So needless to say, when I speak about the failures of Eddie Hearn and his fighters lately, it's only relevant to his fighters' losses or poor performances against non-Matchroom fighters. So before that world title fight main event came Mark Castro versus Agustin Ezekiel Quintana, and 2 fights before that on the card was the fight between Jalil Hackett and Jose Ramon Vazquez. I will address both of the fights before getting into Eddie Hearn's comments about them. So sticking with the chronology, let's take a look at the Jalil Hackett fight. The 21-year-old Hackett had a record of 9-0 going in against the 31-year-old Puerto Rican Jose Ramon, who was 13-1 coming into the fight. As for the odds, I definitely remember seeing Hackett as a 1-25 favourite before the fight on the bookies I was using, but I don't remember what Ramon was. But here it shows Hackett as a -2000 favourite, which translates to 1-20, and Ramon as a +900 dog, which translates to 9-1. So Hackett was a heavy favourite coming in, so the fight was surely expected to be one-sided in his favour. But the fight would turn out to be a very closely contested bout from start to finish, and Ramon went on to nick it on the cards after 10 rounds. Now, I won't run this fight down again because I did it in a previous video, so let me play the clip from that video of how I scored the fight round for round. Excuse the low audio quality on this one.
Alright, so here goes nothing. I have round 1 to Ramon off of that nice accurate jab. Round 2 was a bit closer, but Ramon still just a bit cleaner and more accurate with the jab, so I also gave round 2 to Ramon. Round 3 I gave to Hackett for doing the better bodywork. Round 4 I gave to Hackett for the better bodywork again and just winning the exchanges. 5th round I also gave to Hackett for his effective pressure and still coming off looking stronger in the exchanges. Round 6 we have, in my opinion, the closest round in the fight. The two went 50-50 for effective punches in my eyes, but I edged it to Hackett as he was the aggressor. Round 7 I gave to Rahman from just getting the cleaner punches in all round. Round 8 went to Hackett for me for his aggression and for winning those exchanges again. Round 9 for me was a clear Rahman round for just outboxing Hackett in that one. And finally round 10 I gave to Rahman from landing good shots on the back foot again, and not much done by Hackett in that 10th and final round. So if you didn't keep count of that, that's round 1 to Rahman, round 2 to Rahman, round 3 to Hackett, round 4 to Hackett, round 5 to Hackett, round 6 to Hackett, round 7 to Rahman, round 8 to Hackett, round 9 to Rahman, and round 10 to Rahman. So that, I hate to say it, adds up to 5 rounds apiece, so I had the fight as a 95-95 draw on my cards, which would of course mean the young fighter would still be undefeated, but would have a blemish on his record. Round 2 and round 6 were the only two disputable rounds in my eyes, and I of course gave round 2 to Rahman and round 6 to Hackett. So yeah, no robbery here. One judge having it 6-4 to Hackett and the other two having it 6-4 to Rahman is fair in my eyes. But yeah, that was a good competitive fight, as I said. Good test for Hackett. He couldn't stay consistent with the jab and work off it as he wanted to. Took some shots to give some, which yeah, you can't swim without getting wet, just like you can't box without getting hit of course, but there's still a threshold for defensive responsibility. And he got tired late on.
So yeah, I had the fight a draw, but on the official card, Rahman got it by a split decision, as you just heard from the clip of my old video. So even if you can make a decent case for a Hackett win and you reckon the judges swayed it to the hometown fighter because it was somewhat close in there, an undefeated prospect coming in as that much of a favourite and merely being taken the distance isn't the best look. Now when you talk about actually losing it on the cards, that's a whole different story. But yeah, let's move on to the Marc Castro fight now. So the 25-year-old Marc Castro had a record of 13-0 and was a 1-16 favourite coming in against the 28-year-old Agustin Quintana, who had a record of 20-2 with one draw coming into the fight and came in as a 7-1 underdog. So we've got another case of the Eddie Hearn fighter coming in as a huge favourite here. Now, I've got to break it to you guys. Being the rotten casual I am, I didn't catch this one live as I was watching UFC 310 at the time. And the issue here is that unlike the Jalil Hackett fight that Matchroom posted in full on their YouTube channel, I can't find it anywhere online to watch this Marc Castro vs Quintana fight in full, so I won't be able to reference my scoring or how the fight generally looks scoring wise. Not that you guys would care about my scorecard anyway, plus the focus here ain't the fights themselves but more so the results. I've watched the highlights a couple times, but there's no point in referencing how the fight looked on the highlights when we're talking about scorecards. I might be a rotten casual, but I'm not a regarded rotten casual out here. So yeah, on the cards, this fight ended up being a split decision. One judge having it 96-94 for Castro, and the other two both had it 97-93 for Quintana. So yeah, some people are saying that Jalil Hackett got robbed against Rahman, but I don't see too many people contesting this Marc Castro decision. It did look like Castro was kind of getting punched up, to be fair, but yeah, anyone who watched it in full, do let me know in the comments if there's any case for a Castro win or even a draw. But now, let's get to the good part, which is Eddie Hearn's reaction to both Jalil Hackett and Marc Castro's respective losses, or actually seemingly by the clips I'm about to play, Eddie Hearn's reaction to the fans' reaction to those losses. To give a pre-warning before I play these clips, look, nothing Eddie Hearn is saying in these clips I'm about to play is wrong. He has shown an attitude that is good for boxing, and I personally agree with the way he is going about things. But remember, the title of this video is the question, is it the worst time to be an Eddie Hearn fighter? Not, is Eddie Hearn's current attitude good for boxing? And as this video goes on and we look at more of this Eddie Hearn stuff, we will uncover why in some cases it might not be the most ideal period of time to be promoted by Eddie Hearn, as opposed to some other points in the past few years. Just had to say that before anyone rushes to the comments thinking that I have a personal grievance with Eddie Hearn's recent matchmaking and attitude. So take it easy, it's brewing. So I'm going to play two back-to-back clips now from both Fight Hub TV and The Stomping Ground of what Eddie Hearn had to say about people's criticism of his matchmaking following those two results from the Puerto Rico card here.
The criticism of your matchmaking, when people bring that up, what goes on through your mind?
I find it, I mean, boxing's strange anyway. Like, you as a fan want good fights, right? You want competitive fights. But yet when someone loses who's not supposed to lose, I get criticised for my matchmaking. It's one of the most bizarre and moronic things in boxing. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Forget the product, which that's important as well. Guys who aren't good enough, either in general or on the night, will get beat. Okay? Firstly, there's no shame in getting beat. It just means you weren't good enough. It's just sport, right? Sometimes you play a game, you're a top team, you get beat by an underdog team. It just happens, right? But also, you know, if you want to talk brutally about the business, Mark Castro, for example, has had, I think, 5 or 6 10-round championship fights. The guy that he boxed was an Argentinian, 20-2. Decent, nowhere near world level, Keyshawn Davis, who Mark Castro's beaten multiple times in the amateurs, is 12-0. Mark's 13-0, right? He has a fight with the Argentinian. Poor performance, in my opinion. Gets beat. What part of he's not good enough do you not understand? And it's not he's not good enough, off you go. It's you can come back and go again. But what I'm looking for, once I build people in 5 or 6 10-round championship fights, I'm looking for those guys with Mark's amateur pedigree to kick on and start to look at top 15 level guys. This Argentinian was nowhere near top 15. Nowhere near. Right? In fact, Mark was like a 7-8 to 1 on favourite to win that fight, yeah? But they chose that opponent because they thought this is a good test. They failed the test. That's it. Do you know what I mean? Jalil Hackett wants to move a little bit quicker. He boxed the pretty average Puerto Rican guy. Actually put up a great fight because he completely fucked himself at the weight, and that's, in my opinion, why he lost. And he got beat. He's not good enough. Do you know what I mean? And then people respond on social media, oh, that's harsh on the fighters. Oh, what do you want me to lie? Well, you say he was good enough? I can't say he was good enough because he lost. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to, like, when you're matching a prospect, yeah, 6-rounder, 6-rounder, 8-rounder, yeah, that's like, you've got to at least not make it embarrassing. But once you start having 4 or 5 10-round fights, and we've invested hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in these fighters, I need to find out how good you are. And I'm not even throwing you in deep, by the way. I'm just throwing you in a level that I need you to cruise past, and you got beat. So that shows me you're either not at the level or you had a bad performance. Okay? And it's not, thanks very much, have a nice life. It's just, we need to evaluate where you are. Because as a business, we can't just keep throwing hundreds and thousands of dollars at you if you're not going to go on and become world championship level. We shouldn't go soft in this instance. Like, we don't throw fighters into the wolves in the 6-fight, 10-fight. We just want to know that you're on the right path to reach world level. And not everybody is good enough. And that's the reality. So I would rather be accused of making reasonably competitive fights where sometimes your prospect loses than just giving them just shit. So they get to 16-0, 20-0, they've never boxed anyone, they step up to top 15 and just get spanked straight off the bat. So I'll continue what I'm doing, and if you don't like it, don't watch. But if you're good enough, you will be just fine.
One of the questions I had for Eddie, which I think actually works with you being sat here, is you had a very passionate rant about matchmaking. People still seem to criticise your stance on it, which I find a bit baffling.
Yeah, I'll let him talk in a minute because he's a big advocate of real fights only. I mean, he did it his whole career. I just think what you got to understand is these, like, sometimes if you use Puerto Rico as an example, 2 of our guys lost in fights they were supposed to win. Yeah. So Mark Castro was like 7-1 on to win that fight. Now the odds don't always make sense because people just don't know enough about the opponents and stuff like that.
A perceived risk.
Yeah. So, but at the end of the day, his team had 3 options. They chose him. I've put a huge amount of money into Mark Castro already. If he can't beat that guy, the reality is he's going to only get to a certain level in the sport. At the moment, now you can come back, you can improve, it can be a poor performance, and that's why you get another chance. But Jalil Hackett, you know, went over, they wanted that test, and he made the weight shit, in my opinion, and he lost. But, like, Sonny knows how we match prospects. We don't match prospects in 50-50 fights, but we want to make them competitive. And what it means is if you're not winning those fights, you're just not good enough.
Yeah.
I think,
which is a brutal reality.
You know, the fans are like, on one hand, they're like, oh, we just want real fights. And then someone gets beat and they go, oh, you're getting your fighters beat. It's like, you go, I mean, I just don't, it's the weirdest thing ever.
There's too many in boxing where, don't get me wrong, I think you need to get into the rounds. I think, and like Eddie said, those 6, 6, 8, first 10 rounders, you want problems. You don't want a whole load of problems all at once. If you can get a fighter through 10 fights maybe, and they've faced a southpaw, they've faced a wild fighter, the one that's got a bit more heavy-handed, the one that's maybe a bit boxer, like, you know, they've covered some bases, the box ticking exercises, that when now they might have stepped up a level in a proper fight and the eyes are on them, and now they've got 2 or 3 or 4 of the single problems that they've been facing before, they will be more adept and more comfortable to actually try and challenge it. I think what kills it is when you can take a great fighter, give them 15 easy nights, 15 they're definitely going to win, and it will ruin the fighter. And I could sit here and pull people's name, I'm not going to do that, but 15 fights for me, that's the magic number. If they don't have a hard fight in that time, they're a ruined fighter.
You end up treading water over 2 or 3 years, and you're just not tested. And also, I think the fighter loses his buzz, it just becomes too early.
When you're expected to win over boring 8 rounds.
Or what happens is the other side of that is they do that, they get to 15-0, 20-0, and then because you've got a good record and you've been built up the rankings, you're going to get a big fight. Then you get a big fight and you're not even competitive because you've never been anywhere near that kind of level before, and it's just a waste of time.
I had to play what Sonny Edwards said there as well because it is relevant here, and I'll reiterate, I don't disagree with a word of what Eddie is saying here, but he is responding to criticism in these statements, so clearly not everyone is of his ideology here. But as I said in my video reacting to Jalil Hackett's fight, although you do need to be tested sooner rather than later, and the guys that Castro and Hackett both lost to are guys that they should have been beaten realistically, this thing of Eddie Hearn saying that some of his fighters are not good enough in such brazen fashion is new for him. So it's somewhat unfortunate for the current Eddie Hearn prospects to have to be subjected to this when previous prospects perhaps got better treatment. So earlier I referenced Riyadh's season and how it's changed boxing, and although these matchroom fighters' losses I'm speaking of here aren't on Riyadh season cards, I do believe that the existence of Riyadh season boxing has and will continue to have more of an influence on the matchmaking of lower level cards and domestic cards and stuff, especially on shows promoted by an Eddie Hearn who has profited greatly from the style of matchmaking on the Riyadh season cards. Seeing as his pockets have benefited greatly from this model, I'm sure he will adopt it for all of his fighters down the list that are not fighting on these big super cards yet. And yes, Agustin Quintana and Jose Roman, these aren't names that you would see on Riyadh season cards. They might be somewhat tough fights, but they are tests you are expected to overcome as a prospect for the most part. So perhaps the criticism towards Eddie's matchmaking was totally unjustified, and it was just a coincidence that 2 of his fighters stepped in as massive favourites and lost their undefeated records on the same night, just a week after one of his prospects won a robbery. But even if it is all coincidence and it wasn't due to careless matchmaking, we can surely tell by the way Eddie is talking here that going forward, we will see him matching his prospects in massive step-ups in ways that he never used to before. And I am all for prospects stepping up the competition early so they can dare to be great instead of being babied to 15-0 or even 20-0. But in terms of a long-term business plan, this might not be the way to go with all of your fighters, but I'm going to touch more on the long-term stuff later when I bring this video full circle. But before I move on from these 2 Puerto Rico fights, I will bring light to one thing about the matchmaking. So the guy who Hackett fought in Jose Roman is of course Puerto Rican, so people are obviously saying that Hackett was on the receiving end of a hometown decision if you read the comments on the video of that fight. You know, the American guy is always going to get robbed in Puerto Rico. Happened to Lamont Roach back in the day when his fight with Orlando Cruz was scored a draw. Even if Jalil Hackett did struggle because he made the weight bad and lacked discipline, and even if he should have made handier work of the 9-1 underdog Roman, we still got to acknowledge that on the chance that the tricky and crafty Jose Roman takes him the distance, there's a good chance that Hackett gets robbed. Now, I'm not saying it's a robbery against Hackett, there's quite an easy case for 96-94 to Roman, but I do find it slightly unfair to Hackett that his own promoter didn't even bring light to the fact that this Puerto Rican judging thing may have been a factor in the outcome when talking about the fight. In contrast to him saying a week before that you could give Cameron Vong a draw in the Gavin Gwynn fight. But I think Eddie Hearn was just being bullish with his words when it came to Hackett and Castro, as he was responding to critics in these statements. Eddie Hearn always does a great job of talking up his fighters, and I'm not trying to suggest here that Hearn is being more sensitive and forgiving of Vong's performance as he favours his English fighters more, because Eddie is always doing a great job of talking up his American fighters too. But yeah, if more Eddie Hearn fighters start losing like this, I'm sure it won't be great for these fighters if their own promoter starts going around saying that they're not good enough, even if it is true, and even if the honesty is only being spilled out in a rant and they are getting caught in the crossfires. So yes, now, the very next week after this, another Eddie Hearn fighter in Chev Clark lost his O. Again, this is an example in which Eddie Hearn wasn't as tough on his fighter after the performance. Clark is an English fighter just like Cameron Vong, but again, I'm not saying Eddie is biased here. You know, Clark's loss is probably more forgivable on paper than Hackett and Castro's losses. But again, it's just mad the little skid Eddie Hearn went on here, so we'll take a quick look at that fight. Now coming into it, the 34-year-old Chev Clark, 34-year-old prospect I know, was 10-0 coming into the fight with the 15-0 Leonardo Mosquera for this vacant European Cruiserweight title fight. So this Mosquera guy was no joke at all. But as I've been saying, these matchroom fighters have been coming in as massive favourites and losing. Chev Clark wasn't as big a favourite as the previous fighters we've just looked at, but he was a 1-4 favourite coming in, and Mosquera was a 3-1 dog. So in the fight, Chev Clark was knocked down hard early in round 1. Never a good look for the 1-4 favourite, but he managed to recover and get back into it, and the two men went on to have a back and forth competitive 12-round battle with a handful of close rounds in there. Personally, having just rewatched that whole fight to give my scorecard, if indeed any of you care about my scorecards, I had Clark winning 7 rounds to 5, which would be a 114 to 113 card with the 10-8 round he conceded in the first. But as for the official judges' cards, one judge had it 117 to 113 to Clark, which is some next card with a bunch of even rounds. If my math is correct, with the Mosquera knockdown, that would be 7 rounds to Clark, 2 rounds to Mosquera, one being a 10-8, and 3 even rounds, which is just wild, but it shows how tough the fight was to score. And the other 2 cards were 115 to 112 and 116 to 112, both in favour of Mosquera. So yes, Chev Clark lost to Leonardo Mosquera by way of a split decision. Now, I'll play Eddie Hearn's reaction just for the sake of continuation again, although his comments here are pretty normal.
You get a lot of stick by putting your fighters in tough tests so early on in the career. I know Chev Clark is probably 12, 13 I believe.
10-0.
10-0 coming in. 11th fight coming into this one. Tough fight. I think the knockdown sort of, he didn't get his rhythm until the 4th round after that, so it was unlucky to get that knockdown so early on.
It was a terrible start. Couldn't have been any worse. I mean, I think Chev is now getting the moniker of someone that's very aggressive, comes forward, trades up from the off, and you just, as you go through the levels, you just got to be a bit cuter with it. And he came out all guns blazing, walked onto a big, I think it was a left hook, and he went down heavy, and he showed unbelievable heart to come back. And I know, Eddie Hearn's fighter lost tonight. Eddie Hearn's fighter lost against a 15-0 in a fantastic European title fight. I mean, I'm real proud of Chev, and by the way, I'd love to run it back. But again, I don't, this is not, people talk back at like the Castro and the Jalil Hackett defeats. This is nothing like that. This is a proper fight for the European title. I still thought Chev would win, but Mosquera was really tough and really well conditioned. I thought he probably edged the fight. Thought it was very close. Chev definitely won the back half of the fight, but I don't think wide enough necessarily. And I think he'll learn a lot from it and he'll come back. But also Chev is not a spring chicken. He's won the British title. He's boxed on big cards in Los Angeles, etc. That was the right fight for him tonight. That wasn't a step too early. That was the right fight for him. He just had a terrible start and probably underperformed a little bit. And if that didn't happen early on, I believe he would have edged out a very good fighter. A fighter that I believe is world level in Mosquera. Thought Chev against Mosquera's fight tonight, I thought it was a brilliant fight.
How did you have it?
It's a tough one to score because it's like Chev had a disaster start, right? First round 10-8, I think 2, 3, 4, like he lost most of the early rounds. And then I thought he'd come back winning 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 was a swing round, 11, I don't know. My gut feeling was I think it's going to go with Mosquera, but at the same time thought we might have nicked it, might have edged it, but I'd love to do it again. When you get dropped in the first round and you lose opening probably 4 rounds, it's very difficult to come back into the fight, and I thought he did amazingly well, showed a lot of heart, and Chev's always in good fights, but he's kind of getting that reputation for the guy who comes forward and trades. He traded up from like the first 5 seconds of the fight, and you just can't do that as you go through the levels.
So yeah, Eddie Hearn is right in most of what he's saying here. It's good that he's talking up the quality of the fight, plus nobody can really critique the matchmaking here, because although Chev Clark is young in his pro career and has or had the record of a prospect, the guy's 34 years old, so it was valid to put him in that European title fight in his 11th pro fight. Any promoter would have done that at any point in time. You need to make up for lost time when you go pro in your 30s. To nitpick though, I do think he could have made a better case that his fighter deserved the win here. I know that when he does that he gets slack for being biased, but I think there's even a case for giving Chev Clark 8 rounds in there, so to talk like he was hoping that Clark would have edged it is interesting because we've seen Eddie Hearn go crazy about 1 round differences on the cards for fighters in the past. You know, going mad about 116, 112s in certain fights. But look, again, this Chev Clark fight happened within a 2-week span of the other 3 fights I just spoke about, so Eddie Hearn was probably a bit burnt out and accepting of it at that point. So Chev Clark just happened to not be treated to Eddie Hearn's car salesman spiel of talking like his guy should have won. And I think I actually remember Eddie Hearn making an even worse case for Clark possibly deserving the nod on the cards in his official in-ring interview after the fight. But that ain't on YouTube unlike the other interviews on that fight night, so I can't reference it here. But yeah, nothing abnormal with this Chev Clark loss and Eddie Hearn's reaction to it. But I just wanted to add it in because it's mad how 3 of his prospects lost their O within a week. I'm not doing this video just to focus on what it's like to be an Eddie Hearn fighter right now and talk about how things are changing now. I ain't even gonna lie, I'm also here today to highlight Eddie Hearn's recent losing streak, so to speak. I know a lot of his fighters are also winning, but with the way Oscar De La Hoya has been clowning Eddie Hearn, this whole thing about his fighters losing really has become a thing. So on that topic, let's talk about the high profile main event losses of Eddie Hearn fighters in 2024. Of course focusing on matchroom fighters losing to non-matchroom fighters. So the first fight of any significance in 2024 was Artur Beterbiev vs Callum Smith in January, Smith being an Eddie Hearn fighter. And Beterbiev of course stopped Callum Smith in that fight, but nothing out of the norm there. You put a Brit against a Russian in a light heavyweight world title fight and you know what you're in for. Nothing much to speak about in February now. March was that AJ Ngannou card, which was a very successful night for Eddie Hearn. But then in April you've got the Haney vs Garcia fight. And Haney wasn't an Eddie Hearn fighter at that point per se, but he was previously signed with Matchroom Boxing in the past, and it looks as if Eddie Hearn was representing Haney in this fight. You know, Team Haney against Oscar De La Hoya's Ryan Garcia. De La Hoya being a great rival promoter of Hearn, as we know. And of course in that fight, Garcia battered Haney around the ring and knocked him down multiple times in a fight which tarnished the image of Devin Haney in the eyes of many fans, thus closing off any worthy investments available for Eddie Hearn to make with Devin Haney in the near future, as seen by Eddie Hearn pulling out of the purse bid for Haney's planned fight with Sandor Martin not long after the Garcia loss. But now we move on to May, and this is where it starts to get interesting with the Riyadh season cards. So first of all, we look to the Usyk Fury 1 undercard, in which we had Eddie Hearn fighter Joe Cordina fighting Anto Kakachi in the defense of his IBF 130-pound title. Kakachi was promoted by Frank Warren's Queensbury. And I'll reference the odds again here to highlight the upsets. To translate the Yankee odds here, it looks as if Cordina was a 2-13 favourite and Kakachi was a 17-4 dog. And in the fight, Kakachi would stop Joe Cordina in an emphatic performance to take his world title belt. Oof, a world title fight lost to a Frank Warren fighter on a big Saudi card. So speaking of a Frank Warren fighter defeating an Eddie Hearn fighter on a big Saudi card, that brings us to the Matchroom vs Queensbury 5 vs 5 card now on June 1st, in which Team Queensbury clean sweep Team Matchroom. Oof, maron. So on that card we saw Willie Hutchinson defeating Craig Richards, and after this we saw Nick Ball defeating Raymond Ford for Ford's WBA featherweight title, so a world title loss for Team Matchroom here. Then we had Hamza Shiraz stopping Ammo Williams, Daniel Dubois stopping Filip Hrgovic, and finally Zhilei Zhang stopping Deontay Wilder. And with the point system in place, that ended things at 10-0 to Team Queensbury, as it was 2 points for a knockout win and double points for the captain's victory. And the captain of Team Queensbury was Hamza Shiraz, who of course got the KO. And just to note as well, 3 of the 5 Eddie Hearn fighters who lost that night came in as betting favourites as well, that being Craig Richards, Ray Ford and Filip Hrgovic. Now I know this was great business for both Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn, all set up by Turkel Al-Sheikh, who has had the 2 former rival promoters working together in Riyadh season, and this night would have been a big payday for Eddie Hearn. But there was a winning check of $3 million for the promoter whose team won the 5 vs 5, so that of course went to Frank Warren. So Eddie Hearn can play the happy to be here in Saudi making money thing all he likes, but surely that one's got to hurt. So a case can be made that Frank Warren has benefited from Riyadh season more than Hearn has, this fight night being a huge signifier of that. But I'll get into the Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn rivalry a bit more after we look at more of these Eddie Hearn losses in 2024. So we fast forward to August for the next significant loss now. This was a big one, that being Israil Magomadov's loss to pound for pound star Terence Crawford, a fight in which Magomedov lost his WBA super welterweight title to the debutant of the weight class in Crawford. Crawford got the unanimous decision win in that one. Now this was a competitive fight, but Eddie Hearn going crazy over the 116-112 card in favour of Crawford was insane, Cope, I won't lie. But again, it is good to defend your fighter, of course, it's his job. So moving on to September now, we have matchroom fighter Edgar Berlanga losing to Canelo Alvarez by unanimous decision. So an Eddie Hearn fighter losing a high profile fight again, but nothing out of the norm here in terms of the expected result. But the week after this, we had the big one. The IBF World title fight between Anthony Joshua and Daniel Dubois in Wembley Stadium. Now we all know that AJ is Eddie Hearn's big cash cow. Over the last decade, Eddie Hearn has been perfect for Anthony Joshua's boxing career, and Anthony Joshua has been perfect for Eddie Hearn's promoting career. Things did go downhill a bit when AJ lost his unified title to Alexander Usyk and then failed to regain the titles in the rematch, but since then, AJ went on a 4-fight win streak in an effort of great matchmaking from Eddie Hearn. And although Dubois was coming in as a champ against AJ, he weren't no real world champ, he was just upgraded from interim champ. And Dubois was the guy that quit against Usyk, remember, so surely AJ was going to batter him. That's what the fans expected, and on the odds, AJ did come in as a massive favourite. But when the fight happened, we all know that Dubois went on to absolutely destroy AJ. That's another big one that surely got a hurt for Hearn, with AJ, his main guy, failing to regain a world title, thus limiting the opportunity for some big money world heavyweight title fights for AJ. All Hearn could do is cope after that one. Massive loss for him, probably the biggest one of the year. Also, Dubois is a Frank Warren fighter, of course. Oh yeah, and on that undercard, Eddie Hearn fighter Josh Warrington lost to Frank Warren fighter Anto Kakachi in a world title fight. Plus Ishmael Davis of Matchroom Boxing lost to Josh Kelly on the card as well. Just 3 weeks after that, on October 12th, we had another big loss for an Eddie Hearn fighter. This was in the big undisputed light heavyweight title fight between the two undefeated Russians in Dmitry Bivol and Artur Beterbiev. Dmitry Bivol being the Eddie Hearn fighter in this one and coming in as the WBA and IBO champion in the unification fight. And Dmitry Bivol went on to lose to Beterbiev by a majority decision after a competitive and closely contested 12-round battle. Of course, Eddie Hearn heavily disputed the decision and was even talking like Bivol got robbed in there. Doing his job here, but I think he was going a bit overboard with this one. I personally had Beterbiev winning the fight watching that one live, and I was shocked to see how many people were saying that Bivol got robbed in there. And just like the Crawford Magomedov fight, the backlash over the 116-112 card in favour of Beterbiev was kinda silly, as there were a good few swing rounds in there, and there were multiple clear Beterbiev rounds, so one judge giving him 8 rounds ain't that deep at all. Nothing to talk about for November now. Then in December, on the 7th, we had 2 of Eddie Hearn's prospects losing their own on the same night on a Puerto Rico card. Whatever happened there. Then the Shev Clark loss the week after that. And then the week after the Shev Clark fight, we had the Usyk Fury 2 card. Only one Eddie Hearn fighter officially lost that night, that being Ishmael Davis, who was a massive underdog anyway. But there's more to the Usyk Fury 2 undercard on Eddie Hearn's side of things, so I do want to look at that night in isolation now. But first, just to reflect on those losses in 2024. Yeah, that was a bunch of big losses there for Hearn. Of course, a bunch of his fighters won in 2024 as well, but at the highest level, the losses definitely outweighed the wins. If any of you have watched Oscar De La Hoya's Clapback Thursdays, in which he talks about all of Eddie Hearn's losses, but you never actually conceptualize the chronology of the losses that he's faced like that, then I hope that I've just put that all into perspective nicely for you guys. So the Alexander Usyk vs Tyson Fury 2 card on December 21st of 2024, that big unified heavyweight title fight rematch as the main event. Now that fight had nothing to do with Eddie Hearn, of course. So I saw a comment underneath some Eddie Hearn interview on the Usyk Fury 2 fight week, I can't remember on what channel, in which the guy said something like, Eddie Hearn is just happy to be here, or something along those lines, and the comment got a bunch of likes. Now as far as I see it, the narrative that Usyk Fury 2 was some nice event for Eddie Hearn to enjoy as a neutral is a complete falsehood, because there was a lot of drama and changes to the undercard that involve Eddie Hearn's fighters, so this wasn't some stress-free period for him just because he wasn't involved in the main event. Then when the card actually took place, things definitely didn't go too great for the matchroom fighters in the ring either. So I've covered extensively on the channel before how much of a mess the whole switch round of that undercard was, so I won't go into full detail again. But let me just show you guys how the card was originally meant to look. So the Eddie Hearn fighters on there are Peter McGrail, Johnny Fisher and Israil Madrimov. Peter McGrail was set to face Queensbury boxing star Dennis McCann in a fight that was 50-50 by the odds. a big Frank Warren vs Eddie Hearn fight, so Eddie Hearn had the chance to get a win back over Frank at the end of the year. And this was a fight that had decent hype behind it after the two men went back and forth at the launch presser. It was expected to be a banger, and Eddie Hearn was talking about that fight with great enthusiasm in the weeks leading up to fight week. And then as for Israel Madrimov, he was looking to recover from his close decision loss to Terence Crawford against a Serhiy Boachuk, whose stock shot up after his performance against Virgil Ortiz back in August. So a massive fight in the stacked 154 pound division here, and definitely a worthy co-main event for the big world heavyweight title fight. So 2 weeks before the card took place, the same night of that Puerto Rico card funnily enough, Madrimov pulled out of his fight against Serhiy Boachuk as he conveniently came down with acute bronchitis shortly after being booked for a fight on another date in the future. I won't go into all that again as I've already done so in 2 different videos. So fellow Matchroom fighter Ishmael Davis stepped in as Madrimov's replacement to face Serhiy Boachuk. So the quality of the co-main event was hurt badly, as we went from a former world champion in that spot to a guy who's never even won a belt of any variety. And here's how the card looked after that fight was changed. And notice how they also decided to move Dennis McCann vs Peter McGrail above the Johnny Fisher fight as well. They must have realised that that was the better fight. But fast forward a week now, another cancellation would occur when one Dennis McCann would fail a drugs test. Whatever happened there, meaning his fight with Peter McGrail was now off. And a few days later, at the start of fight week, one Reese Edwards stepped in to face Peter McGrail on very short notice. So Eddie Hearn's fighter now had a new opponent, a 16-0 Welshman who fights under the Boxer promotional stable. Now this McGrail vs Edwards fight had nowhere near as much hype on it as the McGrail vs McCann fight did. The McGrail vs McCann fight was the most competitive fight on the whole card on paper. But now Peter McGrail was a massive favourite in this fight that he didn't have much to gain from. A 2-9 favourite to be exact, against a 16-5 underdog Reese Edwards. McGrail was a campaigning super bantamweight, and he was to be challenging Dennis McCann for a bunch of belts. But he had to take this fight with Reese Edwards up at super featherweight due to the late notice element on Edwards' part, and there was nothing on the line here. So this is how the card looked on paper after Dennis McCann was removed from it. But here's the real damning part. When the fight night would actually commence, Peter McGrail's spot on the card was actually moved down even further and took place before the Lee McGregor vs Isaac Lowe fight. So barely anyone was in the crowd yet when Peter McGrail and Reese Edwards fought. But Peter McGrail did go on to win the fight, so it's all well and good, right? He could only beat the man in front of him, and it was a win on a massive card. But the thing is, it wasn't the most convincing win at all. I mean, I did a poll the day after the fact to see who people think won that fight. It's a small sample size, I know, because this is a very small channel, but as you can see here, most people actually had Reese Edwards winning, and I can see why. I had Peter McGrail on my accumulator that night, and when the fight finished, I truly wasn't sure about which way it would go. Because although Peter McGrail outworked Edwards for the most part, as the fight went on, the single counter shots that Edwards were landing looked to be more significant than McGrail's sort of pity-patter shots on the guard, or all that ussy, if you know you know. And you could even give Edwards a couple of the rounds in the first half of the fight as well. So yeah, instead of this 50-50 super bantamweight affair up the card that Eddie Hearn was hyping up, a fight that probably would have had big world title shot implications in a weight class that has Noah Inoue as its undisputed champ, more on Inoue later, we instead got this short notice fight in front of nobody in which McGrail came in as a heavy favourite and edged out a decision. And nobody is really talking about that fight now. And if anything, Reese Edwards got more clout in the immediate aftermath for taking the fight on such short notice. But if Peter McGrail had a win over Dennis McCann now, Hearn would have a massive star on his hands. So could the night get any worse for Matchroom fighters here? Well, the next Matchroom fighter to fight on the card was Eddie Hearn's big heavyweight ticket seller Johnny Fisher, who took on Dave Allen. And much like Peter McGrail, Johnny Fisher won the fight on the cards. So 2 out of 2 for the Matchroom boys at that point in the night. But we all know there's an even bigger asterisk over Johnny Fisher's victory. So Johnny Fisher came in as a big favourite against Dave Allen. He was a 1-10 favourite and Allen was a 6-1 dog. So the undefeated Fisher was very much expected to topple over the old gatekeeper Allen. All the hype was behind Johnny Fisher coming off of his big first round knockout win over Alan Babbage, which topped off his 7-fight knockout streak. And Dave Allen had 6 losses at this point and had already been used as a stepping stone for the likes of Fraser Clark. So it was a question of how long Dave Allen could hang in there for, and how much of a test he could provide for the young phenom Johnny Fisher. But when the fight would commence, boy did things not go to plan. So before addressing the big moment in the fight, as for the first 4 rounds, yes, Johnny Fisher did win all of them rounds. There seems to be a bit of a narrative that he completely dominated those rounds, but I wouldn't go that far. Allen landed some good shots in the second, and and was giving Fisher problems in the third as well. And the fourth was competitive too, but yeah, I do think Fisher won all of those 4 rounds. But then in the fifth, this would happen.
I'd go to an island and I'd move there and I'd never box again.
Then after this heavy knockdown, Allen would follow up with a big onslaught to try and get Fisher out of there, and you can see Eddie Hearn seems rather troubled at this point. But Fisher would recover as well as he could for the state that he was in and made it out of the round. Then from round 6 up to the 10th and final round, Dave Allen was beating Johnny Fisher up with clubbing blows, uppercuts and body shots. And it's interesting because going into the fight, the narrative was about whether or not Dave Allen could survive Johnny Fisher. You know, the over odds for even the early rounds were quite high going into the fight. But going into the second half of the fight, the question was whether or not Johnny Fisher could survive Dave Allen. And yes, Johnny Fisher did show good heart and made it to hear the final bell, and he remained competitive in there and landed some shots here and there. But round 6 to 10 all went to the Doncaster De La Hoya on my cards. So after his 10-8 in the 5th, giving Dave Allen all the rest of the rounds had him 96 and 93 up on my card in the end. And probably almost everyone else had it 96 and 93 for Allen, apart from 2 of the official judges on the night. So yes, one judge did rightfully have it 96 and 93 in favour of Dave Allen, but the other 2 had it 95 to 94 for Johnny Fisher, awarding Johnny Fisher the split decision win on the cards. Wow, that means those judges gave Johnny Fisher 2 of the last 5 rounds, which is insane. It would even be a far cry to make a case for Fisher winning one of those rounds from 6 to 10. And even if you give one of them rounds to Fisher, thus levelling things out at 5 rounds apiece, Allen would still have won thanks to the 10-8 round in his favour. So the judges couldn't try and go for a cheeky draw here, they had to straight up rob Dave Allen, to put it bluntly. Now as for Eddie Hearn's reaction, I'm not going to play the clips for this one and long this video out even more, but of course he was saying that it wasn't a robbery and that it was a close fight and he was hoping for a draw in the end or whatever, which again is the right thing for him to do as a promoter. And in the brief immediate interview after the fight, he spouted out a case for a Johnny Fisher draw without even taking a second to think, so he does have his fighter's best interest at heart. But to pick apart what Eddie is saying anyway, in his first IFL TV interview after the whole fight night, he was going on like Johnny Fisher definitely won the 10th round, which is kinda wild. Yes, it was closer than the 4 rounds prior to it, but I just don't see how you give him that round. Then he talks about how the 7th could go either way, which is questionable because you could argue that the 7th is the clearest Dave Allen round of the fight other than the knockdown round. But yeah, Eddie Hearn is saying what he can to keep Johnny Fisher's reputation up as much as possible, as he should. But to nitpick again, the thing about the draw is senseless because when there's a 10-8 round in there, this means the total score cannot be even, except in the case of a 10-10 round being scored elsewhere in the fight, which is rare and shunned upon in the judging of professional boxing. But when being interviewed about this fight, Eddie himself also said that a round can only be 10-9 unless there is a knockdown and therefore a 10-8 round. So by his logic, a draw in this fight is impossible. So even though you guys probably knew this already, that's confirmation that if Eddie Hearn says that he was hoping for his fighter to get a draw, he really thinks that they lost. But don't get me wrong, Fisher vs Allen was a great fight that I very much enjoyed watching live, and it was cool to see that the two men's respect for each other continued after the fight. And I do rate Dave Allen myself and didn't see Johnny Fisher just battering him about going into it, but Allen actually put on a way better performance than I expected, which was fun to watch. But ultimately, Johnny Fisher is arguably Eddie Hearn's main heavyweight draw just after whatever's left of Anthony Joshua. I'll get to Eddie Hearn's heavyweight stable in more detail later. And he came in as a 1-10 favourite on his big Riyadh season debut, fighting on a massive card to showcase himself to a more global audience, and he got beaten up by a guy who is perceived as washed up and won a robbery in the end. The decision had fans fuming, and the fight itself had Johnny Fisher's detractors feeling like they were proved right and probably dampened the Johnny Fisher hype from the eyes of some Johnny Fisher enthusiasts as well. But as he has spoken about, I do see Eddie Hearn doing the best he can from this situation and making a big rematch between Fisher and Allen here in England, but he better hope Fisher wins that rematch, boy. Now to move on to the third Eddie Hearn fighter on the card, Ishmael Davis. He was the last minute replacement for Majimov, who was stepping in to fight Serhiy Bohachuk on the co-main event. Well, this was shown on the lineup before the fight night would commence, but on the night, this Ishmael Davis vs Serhiy Bohachuk fight did not end up going on just before the main event. Instead, Frank Warren heavyweight Moses Aitama took the co-main event spot with his fight against Dempsey McKean, a fight in which Aitama got the round 1 knockout. Another W for Frank Warren here, huh? But let's take a look at the fight between Davis and Bohachuk in this affair before the co-main event. So it was a fairly competitive start to the fight, but in round 2, Ismail Davis got a bit overzealous and subsequently got put down hard with a Boachuk left hook. Davis got back up to stay in the fight, but Boachuk was just dominating in there from there on. Davis was getting some work in, but all of Boachuk's shots were just way more effective and he just marauded Davis and wore him down. So after round 6, Davis's corner pulled him out of the fight, meaning a stoppage loss for Ismail Davis. Now this wasn't a big L for the Eddie Hearn fighter, as he took the fight on short notice and he was a 6-1 underdog coming in against a world class opponent anyway. And this was Davis' second loss in a row, but that other loss was also against high level competition in Josh Kelly, and it was also a short notice fight on a big undercard of a Riyadh season event. So this might be a case where it is a very good thing to be an Eddie Hearn fighter, well, from a short term monetary standpoint here. This is a guy who never even boxed for a domestic title, and now he's just had 2 massive back-to-back paydays fighting on big undercards of heavyweight title fights, in which Eddie Hearn himself has pointed out made him more money within the space of 3 months than he otherwise might not have even made in his whole career. And I saw Ismail Davis touted by TalkSport as Eddie Hearn's wildcard fighter in the lead up to his fight with Boachuk, which I found pretty cool. You know, he's the guy who comes in last minute and saves these cards. But he's 0-2 in his late notice efforts as of right now. So if his next fight is one of these late notice fights, then he better win it or this shtick is over. I wonder what Eddie Hearn does with him next and whether or not he does try and take the time to actually develop his career. But I'll tell you, in the long run, it will be interesting to see what he can really do with a guy who has taken 2 losses without even ever having fought for an area title, let alone an English, British or European title. So yeah, that was the Usyk vs Fury 2 undercard from the perspective of Eddie Hearn. But sticking to Riyadh season, someone could make a case that Frank Warren has benefited from Riyadh season more than Eddie Hearn has. Both Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn have been the most successful British promoters in recent history. Of course, Frank Warren has been around for longer and was actually rivals with Eddie Hearn's dad Barry Hearn from the late 1980s. And it's a well-known fact that before Turki Al-Sheikh used his great financial influence to get Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn on the same page and doing business together, before that Boxing Day of Reckoning card in late 2023, the 2 men were indeed fierce rivals. They never met up to do business once. They spoke a load of bollocks about each other and each other's fighters on interviews. There was the whole thing with Eddie getting Sky Sports, and they had a bunch of petty legal disputes. But we'll be here all day if we run that all down. The ultimate point that is most relevant here is that before the 2 men started working together and got all buddy-buddy, for the most part, in recent times, Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing was more successful all round than Frank Warren's Queensberry promotions, especially while AJ was at the top. So when they were doing their business separately, and it was about whose shows were better out of the 2, rather than how their respective fighters were doing against each other head to head, Eddie Hearn was seemingly getting the better of things. But now that the 2 men are doing business together, and their fighters are going head to head, which is of course good for boxing all round, Frank Warren definitely appears to be getting the better of things. Now, this isn't by any stretch me trying to suggest that Eddie Hearn has been carefully promoting fraudulent boxers for the past several years and got them all to the top merely by careful matchmaking, and that Queensberry fighters have had the battering of them all along. That notion would be senseless, mainly due to the fact that both the Matchroom and Queensberry stables have been ever changing throughout the years, with new signings happening all the time. Some fighters leaving the respective promotions, some retiring, and some fighters that have stayed within one of the 2 promotional banners either entering or exiting their prime. And I also don't want to give Eddie Hearn an excuse here, but there is also a chance that he has been unlucky here and that this whole Riyadh season stuff has commenced just as his stable is getting weaker, and that most of the Riyadh season matchmakings between Matchroom and Queensberry fighters have been nightmare matchups on the side of Matchroom, which has completely exploited their weak points. By the end of the day, no matter how much money these guys are making, we're not here to ponder about another man's pockets. Ostensibly, Frank Warren does seem to be getting the better of things right now. And it's funny because people talk about Eddie Hearn's subservience to Turki Al-Sheikh and how Turki is always bantering him and how he's always having people call him at all times of the night for business related things. But do remember, Frank Warren was doing business with Turki Al-Sheikh first, because that Fury vs Ngannou card came just before the Day of Reckoning card. So maybe Frank Warren had built a better relationship with His Excellency before Eddie Hearn came along, and that's why Frank Warren might get more respect from Turki. Not that Turki doesn't respect Eddie Hearn, but I'm sure there are levels. And maybe if Eddie Hearn is having to fight harder for the respect of Turki Al-Sheikh, then he will continue to prioritise putting his fighters in exciting and high-risk fights for Riyadh season cards, rather than fights that are in their best interests. And as I suggested earlier, he might carry this supposed careless matchmaking into his other shows outside of Riyadh season. So basically I'm saying that he could be compromising what is in the best interest of his fighters in the long run just to stay on the Riyadh season train. Again, I know all this stuff is good for boxing and art entertainment, so I'm definitely not complaining. Just to look at it from that perspective, let's just say there's a reason why the promoting was different before all this Riyadh season stuff. But now luckily for us fans, it's boxing over boxer and we're getting all these great cards out here. Another thing to note here is that perhaps Eddie Hearn isn't treated as well by Turkel Al-Sheikh than Frank Warren is, because Eddie isn't subservient enough. We've seen Frank Warren pictured holding Turkel Al-Sheikh's hand, but not Eddie Hearn. So maybe Eddie hasn't been paying his dues, so to speak. You know, in a recent IFL TV interview, Peter Fury made a suggestion about what it takes to get your fighter on a Riyadh season card, which I found funny.
Or should I get my begging bowl out and kiss everybody's ass and say, please let Usyk Fury fight him now, you know, and I'll bend over or whatever you want.
It'll happen if it's going to happen, if it's not, it's not.
But of course, the likes of me would be amused by a comment like that. You know, a bitter broke bum like me suggesting that all rich people do humiliation rituals to get massive amounts of wealth. Of course there's no dodgy business actually going on. That's just things that incels on the internet like me like to theorise about out of hate. All billionaires are normal people just like us, but actually driven and successful. And I love Frank Warren, don't get me wrong. Even if this video does only get a couple hundred views like I expect, I'm still at risk of getting sued by old Frankie boy, so I best be careful. So yeah, big Frank Warren fan over here. But now just to get back to Peter Fury, if any of you dare try say that Peter Fury is being bitter himself here, then don't be silly. Hughie Fury is just hitting his prime now and he has the beating of most of these heavyweights fighting on the Riyadh season shows. Just you wait and see. And if Parker picks up the IBF title against Dubois, then his first defence ought to be against Hughie, so Hughie can get his revenge for that robbery back in the day. Even though I'm trying my hardest to get through this video as quickly as I can, I had to get that in there. So yeah, on the topic of Frank Warren, let's take this time to look at Eddie Hearn's current heavyweight stable, which is perceived to be quite weak. And now, the best way to measure its status is to contrast it to the heavyweight stable of one Frank Warren. So Eddie Hearn currently has 4 heavyweights in his Matchroom stable: Anthony Joshua, Johnny Fisher, Justice Hooney, and Terra Moana. Now, seeing as this is getting on long, I hope I don't need to run down where Anthony Joshua is at in his career in terms of his future chances of being a champion again, but he is still a draw, and best believe Eddie Hearn will still be able to get 2 or 3 massive paydays out of him, win or lose. Then as for the rump for bull Johnny Fisher, although hardcore boxing fans weren't that high on him in the first place anyway, as I mentioned earlier, his status has plummeted big time after that Dave Allen fight, but he is still officially undefeated and has the potential to grow. Pragmatically speaking, he probably doesn't have much of a chance against any of the other top ranked heavyweights around today, let alone Dave Allen in a rematch, but Johnny Fisher is Eddie's boy and he has a good fan base, so even if Fisher can't make any notable mark on the world scene, I'm sure Eddie Hearn can sell tickets with him in domestic level fights at the Copper Bush. But yeah, his world heavyweight title potential isn't great at this point, I must say. Now we look at Justice Hooney, the undefeated Australian up-and-comer. Now with Johnny Fisher getting fully exposed in the eyes of many in that Dave Allen fight, and with everyone thinking that Dave Allen won the fight, there was also a fight in which Justice Hooney was exposed, in that Kevin Lorena fight back on their AJ Ngannou undercard, in which Lorena buzzed Hooney twice, the first time in round 2 and the second time in round 10, badly, absolutely rocked there, showing a very suspect chin. Now Justice Hooney is a good boxer, and he got the unanimous decision win over Lorena in what is a good win. He got the better of all of the rounds in there other than the ones that he was rocked in, and even then I'd probably still give Hooney that second round. But it's not just the fact that Hooney has yet to really take a step up in class and there's already questions around his chin, his power as a heavyweight boxer is also very questionable. He's been active since the Lorena fight and is on a 3-fight knockout streak since then, against much lower level opposition than Lorena by the way. But that Kevin Lorena fight topped off a 4-fight no knockout streak for Justice Hooney. And yes, it is good to show that you can go the rounds, and he is a decent boxer as I said. He can move in there when he puts nice combos together. But up and coming heavyweights are meant to be achieving a higher KO rate than Justice Hooney has displayed. You know, at least Johnny Fisher was on a 7-fight knockout streak before the Dave Allen fight, 3 of which were in round 1, and 1 of those was against a decent name in Alan Babbage. So Justice Hooney has the potential to do things in the division against the right opponent, but to have questionable power and a questionable chin as a heavyweight prospect is less than ideal. Now you look to Terra Moana. Now this 6-0 Australian prospect has a lot of hype behind him, and he looks dangerous, but he has nowhere near taken any notable step up in competition yet. Needless to say, Johnny Fisher and Justice Hooney respectively have way better resumes than Terra Moana in the pros. But the thing that Terra Moana Teramawana, has over them is that he has yet to show any vulnerabilities or that he has any sort of ceiling, so we can only wait and see with him. Eddie Hearn could have something on his hands with Teramawana. He better just hope that he don't end up getting exposed like a bunch of his other prospects have. Now let's turn our attention to Frank Warren's Queensberry Boxing and their heavyweight stable. It is a lot deeper, so get ready. Cool. They've got IBF heavyweight champion of the world Daniel Dubois. They've got Tyson Fury. They've got Joseph Parker. They've got Zhile Zhang, Chinese power. They got Fabio Wardley. They got Moses Aitama. They got Derek Chisora, Joe Joyce, Lawrence Okoli, David Adelai, Solomon Dakers, Vladislav Sarenko, and then you got these 5 prospects who are yet to make any mark in the pros, but I'm sure they have a lot of potential. So yeah, let alone the fact that Queensberry have 13 more fighters in the Premier Division of boxing than Matchroom do, they also have a higher quality. I mean, you put their top 4 side by side to Matchroom's 4 and it's not really close. Then you take a look at the 4 below them on the Queensberry heavyweight roster and compare them to the Matchroom heavyweight roster, and you could even say that these 4 are better than the Matchroom lot all round. Yes, there are winnable fights with the Matchroom guys against some of the Queensberry guys, but all round it ain't even close if we're being real. And remember, heavyweight boxing is blooming and has been a key component of the uptick of Riyadh season boxing. I mean, Fury vs Ngannou was the first Riyadh season card and it was literally a full heavyweight card. And as for the second Riyadh season boxing card, the first one with Eddie Hearn involved, that was the Boxing Day of Reckoning with a heavyweight doubleheader, and 6 of the 8 fights on the card were heavyweight fights. So yeah, you gotta have a strong heavyweight stable when it comes to Riyadh season. Obviously Matchroom can sign other heavyweights, but there's not really many heavyweights out there I see them signing, to be honest. Queensberry have done a better job of snapping up the top amateur heavyweights that have just turned pro and stuff. I mean, unless Matchroom nick Jalalov from Top Rank or something, I don't know, because I doubt any of the Queensberry heavyweights jump ship to Matchroom. But there's a couple of other things to consider here. I was naming the respective heavyweight stables based on what is shown on the website, but on the Queensberry side of things, Joseph Parker is listed as one of their fighters, but he might only be on some 1-fight deal or something. And then with Matchroom, Hrgovic is not shown as being in their stable, but he does have some type of co-promotional fight-by-fight deal with Matchroom or something like that, so even though he's not listed there, he might be more sort of a Matchroom fighter than Parker is a Queensberry fighter. But when I was comparing the stables, I was just going off of what's on paper. Like for example, if you think Matchroom used to have a way better heavyweight stable back in the day in those Dillian Whyte, Derek Chisora days, well just know that Dillian Whyte wasn't officially under the Matchroom stable for the whole time that he was fighting on their shows. He was on some fight-by-fight basis deal. And when Joseph Parker first fought on Matchroom shows twice in a row against both AJ and Whyte, he wasn't even signed to Matchroom yet, as he didn't even go on to sign until 2019. So Matchroom could still get good heavyweights on their shows, but Queensberry's actual stable is much better. But speaking of Dillian Whyte though, with the recent announcement of his fight against Joe Joyce to headline the inaugural Queensberry boxing card on DAZN, Whyte might start to be as much of a Queensberry fighter now as he was a Matchroom fighter in the past. Speaking of heavyweights though, you see when it comes to what some people might perceive as careless matchmaking, and what most of us consider to be exciting 50-50 fights that are good for boxing, I know this is going to sound like crazy Moses Aitama glaze, but I think the fact alone that Eddie Hearn has brought up a Moses Aitama fight for both Johnny Fisher and Justice Hooney shows that he's most certainly not trying to keep them undefeated on their way to a potential world title shot. I don't know if he still wants Fisher vs Aitama after the Allen fight, but anyway, let's be honest, Aitama would be a massive favourite going into either of those fights. Well, he should be. He's a way better boxer than Fisher, and he's got way more power than Hooney. And I would make the guess that Eddie Hearn wants either of those fights on big Riyadh season cards. Therefore, he's happy to compromise the O and potentially the reputation of half of his heavyweight stable to make nice fun 50-50 matches on Riyadh season shows. 50-50, but Aitama knocked both of them out, I can't lie. I am most certainly not complaining, as this is best for our entertainment, but all of this stuff will be new for the managers, trainers and fighters involved. So this stuff about Eddie Hearn's recent decision supposedly not being the best for business in the long run begs the question of whether he has his foot out of the door in the boxing game, if he's looking to retire in the near future, next few years maybe. He used to have a cunning and competitive edge to him when he was fierce rivals with Frank Warren, but now they are on the same page. Has he lost that edge? He is all friendly with Frank Warren now like little fake mates, but Warren's guys are just beating Eddie Hearn's guys for the most part, and although he might be hiding his dismay with these fights, Eddie doesn't seem to care that much on the surface. So is he just happy to ride out the end of his promotional career by getting these big Saudi paydays, not caring about whether his guys win or lose because there is no long-term interest in them? Now all of that talk is theoretical, and I would say that that is not the case, because Eddie does still seem to have a competitive edge. He has fighters that he intends to and will push for greatness, and even if he does retire, he'll likely leave Matchroom Boxing up to Frank Smith, so he's not just going to leave him with a pile of rubbish, is he? As for the upsides of Matchroom Boxing right now that would prove Eddie Hearn might not retire anytime soon, I mean, they have a decent lineup of current world champions who all have the potential to do more in this game than they already have, such as becoming undisputed champs or multi-weight world champs. They've got Boots Ennis, Bam Rodriguez, Shakur Stevenson, Richard Hitchens, and most of all in my eyes, Joy Opataya. Because the hype around Opataya is insane right now, to where if you don't predict him to ease his way to undisputed status at cruiserweight, then you apparently don't know ish about boxing. And although Matchroom have a shallow heavyweight stable as I mentioned before, Alexander Usyk is the man at heavyweight right now, and a lot of people would rate the cruiserweight champ Jai Opataya's chances against Usyk higher than any of the heavyweights within the Queensberry stable. And outside the world champs now, you have Jack Catterall, who has his WBO world title eliminated coming up very shortly against Arnold Barboza, and Catterall is indeed touted to do great things in the 140 pound division. And in the Matchroom stable, you also have the Cuban amateur star Andy Cruz, who is very much touted for greatness in the pros. What do you guys think? Are those 7 fighters alone that I just mentioned enough to prove that Eddie Hearn still has long-term interest in boxing? But there are more guys as well, like Diego Pacheco and Dalton Smith, who both picked up a win lately, on the same night in fact. And Andy Cruz won on that night as well on the same show as Pacheco. Plus Eddie is still running these next gen shows. I mean, you don't put work into a show called Next Gen if you don't have long-term interest in the game. But speaking of Next Gen though, another Eddie Hearn prospect in Junaid Boston just got a lucky and controversial draw in his fight against Bilal Fawaz on a Next Gen show, but that's not relevant enough to get into. I don't think anyone really rates Junaid Boston anyway. And as for other Eddie Hearn shows that have gone well lately, I mean, he started the year out with a bang in Australia with half of his heavyweight stable in Terra Moana and Justice Hooney both getting big knockout wins. And in the main event, his number one star Jai Opataya got a knockout win in a successful title defense. And Eddie Hearn seemed buzzing that night. Maybe Australia is where it's at for him going forward. Maybe he should just go move there. And as for Eddie Hearn still having a cunning edge to him, so you've got Anthony Kakachi, a Queensberry fighter and just turned former IBF super featherweight champ, who has back-to-back wins over Matchroom fighters Joe Cordina and Josh Warrington. And now the mandatory for Kakachi's IBF title was Matchroom fighter Eduardo Nunes, but Kakachi was stripped for opting for a more lucrative fight with Lee Wood instead. Now in recent interviews, Eddie Hearn has been going in on Kakachi and has been spinning this as a blatant duck on Kakachi's part. I know spin is a pejorative term, but I mean it in a positive sense in this context, as Eddie Hearn is making his fighter look better here and the rival fighter look worse, as he is supposed to. And maybe Kakachi is ducking that Sugar Nunes bloke. And then you've got Eddie Hearn going off on Noai Inoue lately, which definitely shows his competitive nature. And this has been in regards to the current undisputed super bantamweight champ Inoue apparently ducking his WBA mandatory MJ Akhmadaliev. Akhmadaliev being a Matchroom fighter, of course. Now this is great stuff promotion wise from Eddie Hearn, because on the grand scheme of things, not that many people have heard of Akhmadaliev, but everyone's heard of Inoue. So if Eddie Hearn, as one of the most influential promoters in the world, is making these bullish statements about one of the best pound for pound boxers in the world, you know, saying stuff like he ought to be knocked off the pound for pound rankings for not fighting Akhmadaliev, then this is great promotion for Akhmadaliev. So yeah, great promotion here and great spin, because I'm not too sure if Inoue is actually ducking Akhmadaliev. Akhmadaliev lost to Marlon Tapales, and Inoue stopped Marlon Tapales. Also, a fairly recent Inoue opponent in Stephen Fulton has just proved to be great again by becoming the 2-weight world champion in a great performance in his rematch against Brandon Figueroa, in a fight that Fulton stepped in as the underdog. So yeah, the guys on Inoue's record are no joke. But Eddie is doing what he can to get Akhmadaliev the Inoue fight, so we love to see it I guess, but personally I'm not too fussed about that Akhmadaliev fight, or seeing Inoue stay at the 122 pound division at all for that matter. I actually think the Nick Bull fight up at 126 is the fight to make, and yeah, I wouldn't be so upset if we don't get Inoue vs Akhmadaliev next. And I'm sure Inoue vs Nick Bull on a Riyadh season card has a way more casual appeal, because Nick Bull has built up his name well on Riyadh season, and as we can see, Inoue is trying to get on the Riyadh season thing now as well. And now, I don't want to take anything away from Eddie Hearn based on a hypothetical here, but look, Nick Bull is a Frank Warren fighter, And if Inoue vs Ball got made and Inoue doesn't fight Akhmadaliev, the way Eddie Hearn has been going on lately with Riyadh season stuff, I wouldn't be so surprised if Eddie Hearn just shrugged it off and got Akhmadaliev his vacant title fight and just goes on to speak about how Inoue vs Nick Ball is good for boxing. Especially if that's on a Riyadh season show that Eddie himself is involved with. He might just do the happy to be here thing. But yeah, we aren't to know how that would go down as of right now. But I shall follow this Inoue vs Akhmadaliev situation closely, as it is a decent measuring stick for where Eddie Hearn is currently at in regards to his competitive edge. Alright, so do I think it is the worst time to be an Eddie Hearn fighter? I would say no. Boxing is changing rapidly and for the good, and the promoters will have to adapt their philosophies to keep up with this new era we are entering. If a fighter is truly good enough, then it is most certainly not the worst time for them to be an Eddie Hearn fighter from what we can tell right now. But what do you guys make of all that? What do you think about Eddie Hearn receiving criticism for his matchmaking? What do you think about a bunch of his fighters losing like that last year? And do you think there's any chance that he has his foot out of the door in this boxing game? And are any of those things even interlinked? Am I just making a long video out of nothing? Are the Jalil Hackett and Mark Castro losses minor on the grand scheme of things and Eddie's losing streak is just a complete coincidence? Also, as for the criticism towards Eddie Hearn's matchmaking, I'll be honest, I'm not even on social media, so I don't even know what the people were saying. But with the passion that Eddie Hearn was responding to it within the interviews, it's safe for me to assume that people online were saying stuff about his matchmaking after that Puerto Rico card. And one more thing before I go, just on the Hackett and Castro losses. Maybe it's specifically the worst time to be an Eddie Hearn fighter if you're an unproven prospect from overseas. I'm sure he'll still invest heavily in his foreign world champions, because if they lose, they already have an established name so they can bounce back quickly. And as for his domestic prospects, he seems to be naturally more forgiving of their losses or poor performances, which I totally get. Like, why is he investing a bunch of money for fighters overseas that he has to travel for them to be losing to random South American guys that he's never heard of? But he's heard of Gavin Gwynn, the guy who Cameron Vong won a robbery over. Then you look to Fisher vs Allen. Best believe Eddie Hearn knows about Dave Allen. So seeing as Eddie Hearn has developed a respect for the likes of Gavin Gwynn and Dave Allen over the years, he could be more patient with his guys having tough fights against them. But as for the guys who Castro and Hackett lost to, perhaps Jose Roman and Agustin Quintana are better boxers than Dave Allen and Gavin Gwynn, but Eddie Hearn has just never heard of them and he just has a domestic bias, but it is a justified bias. Because the likes of Cameron Vong and Johnny Fisher can be great domestic level guys for matchroom shows even if they don't make it to world level. But what's the point in investing in a fighter over in the States if they're not going to surpass domestic level? Eddie ain't trying to run domestic shows in the US, is he? He's only interested in these guys over there if they're going to reach the world stage. But that's not to say that those guys are now finished after only one close loss and deserve to be rubbished off after the fact. And I am a fan of Jalil Hackett, and I do hope he does turn things around and goes on to be world level. But you guys let me know what you think about all that in the comments, and you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.